Okay. Well, good afternoon. We're going to start, as I just said, we'll do some, this is Charles Lloyd Hines. About more than half of the artists that we're going to talk about today have a connection to Provincetown, a real strong connection. Provincetown was the place that drew a lot of the artists to the Cape, and specifically to Provincetown. Now this is Charles Lloyd Hines. He, as you see, his art is, and we're going to see some back and forth, some very academic, realistic, Ripley, for example, and Gamble. And then you see somebody like Hines, who was pretty modern. He was born in 1884, died in 1953, but look at his work. He was very influenced by the Fauves, and you can see that his, I did it again. Why is that not working? Oh, that's okay. Now I'm right. I may just use this. And you can see kind of the Cubist influence in his work. And the Fauve colors. The Fauve colors were the...
I'll just get the, it should say slideshow on the top here.
Yeah. Yeah, the light is, so I'm hitting the wrong key is what I'm doing. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. So you can see the colors are not always natural colors, which was what Matisse and the Fauves kind of came up with, the idea that color could really be about the composition and about how it, you know, again going back to Hoffman, but how the color plays one color against another. And it didn't have to be true. I mean, these artists were moving away from realism. However, we're going to still see some. Now, the next artist is Todd Lindemuth. He was one of the Provincetown printers, one of the few men that was part of the Provincetown printers. And this is one of his woodcuts. And he was, again, he was connected to Provincetown, as was Hines. So the first three have strong connections. And this is one of his very quiet, serene, and you could see the light that was so important. What drew the artist to Provincetown specifically was the light, and you could see the influence that he saw in Provincetown. The next artist is, this is a woodcut of his. The next artist is Russ Moffatt, very important artist. He came to Provincetown in 1913 to study with Hawthorne. He wrote a really important book, Art in Narrow Streets. I think it's still available. It's been reprinted a number of times. I think it's still available in Provincetown at the museum. And he described what it was like living in Provincetown in those early years. We're talking about the first and second decade of the 20th century. I mean, you could rent a studio for $50 or $60 for the season. I mean, think of that compared to what it is today. And that's also one of the reasons why the artists came to Provincetown. Beside the light, it was the European charm, the welcoming, the fishermen, a large Portuguese population that was very open and welcoming, and how cheap it was. And someone asked me earlier, well, what about today? Well, today it's very different. The light hasn't changed, but certainly the prices have. And here is another. We're going to see this one upstairs. Let's go back here. He often did, and we should go look at this one. he did these very interested in the fishermen and the farmers. There were farmers there. And he worked, you really had a sense, there's a primitive aspect of his work, and you do have a sense by his colors of the struggles of, you know, I certainly see that one in, I think that's Conversations by the Shore. And you really have a sense of that with Moffatt's work. His skies, and we'll go upstairs when at the end where we'll see, those skies are very typical of what he did, these sweeps of color. Again, this is not realism, it's representational, but it certainly has an expressionistic quality to it. And actually, he ended up being very influenced by Cubism. And this is certainly a representational painting, but you can see the influence in terms of the perspective. He went down on it, so he kind of flattened it. But I have seen some of Russ Moffatt's work that's totally abstract. The Thomas Hart Benton. He was a regionalist, part of, you know, Grantwood School, American Scene Painting. This is from Martha's Vineyard. As far as I know, he didn't have a connection with Provincetown, but he did the Cape. He started out as a sculptor, which is kind of interesting because when you look at his work, the figures have a kind of sculptural quality to them. Again, they're very expressive. Very interesting. He taught at the Art Students League, and one of his students was Jackson Pollock, who didn't stay with Benton's approach. This is a very famous painting. It's from a scene from Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams. And if you remember, there's Blanche, and they're playing the guys are playing poker or whatever, and there's the bedroom. It is kind of a very seductive painting. And certainly, he was a really important artist. He maintained his kind of expressive approach to representational art, and he kind of fell out of favor when abstract expressionists came in, as almost every other kind of art did, for a while at least. But he's in major museums all over. You know, he's a really important artist. And he had a connection with, there I go again. Okay. No?
That's right, just one quick.
Just once?
There you go.
Oh, okay. All right. This is Charles Casselaw. He was also connected to Provincetown. Very representational painter. He was actually born in Sweden, came to Provincetown. And you see some of, and that is a woodcut that he did. This is Lucy Brown Langille, who was, you're going to see a lot of women now who are very modern. I mean, look at that work. It's abstract. And she was born in New York from a very affluent family. She studied at the Art Students League and then in Paris. And she married William Langille, who was also very affluent. So they were able to paint and not work because there was a fair amount of money involved. But if we look at some of the women that were painting at the time, they were really more modern than some of the men. And when we look at that work, it's another drawing. These are all from Lucy. So she was, this is another woman, Farrell Sibley Worthen. She was clearly influenced by Blanche Lazelle. And this is a white line woodcut. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. I think it's downstairs, I'm pretty sure. Beautiful piece. But her story is kind of interesting. She did her first woodcut in 1911. And then she got married and had children and put away her brushes and her, just like, she was born, by the way, in 1890. She finally, in 1950, she was 60 years old, she came to Provincetown. And from the time until she died in 1986, she did a lot of work. And she was, look at that piece. Very influenced by Cubism. Her granddaughter, Kathy Smith, also works does white line woodcuts, and she's contemporary, a young woman.
Debbie, do you mind repeating her name? I didn't catch it.
You know,
I don't have
it's
it.
the lighting is,
Yep,
I can't hardly see the people.
Okay.
Yeah, go on.
Just repeat the artist's name. I missed this artist. The artist's name.
Oh, Farrell Sibley Worthen.
Okay.
Worthen. Yes, so I can see the people. Is that good enough? Yeah, that's good. That's pretty close to what I'm seeing on the screen. That's a pretty strong image. Again, that's probably pretty small. Now that is not in our collection. I probably should mention this, that I'm showing a lot of works that are not in the collection. Although the piece, this piece is in our collection. It's the only one we have. And I really, and in certain cases with the Bentons, the only one we had was that print. So I showed you the streetcar one, and those are pieces that are not in the collection. I'm not sure where the streetcar one is, a very famous painting. It's probably in some major museum. But what I've done is supplement a lot of the art that we have the images of, and I've downloaded other art to give you a perspective, particularly when what we have in the collection doesn't represent clearly what the artist's work is. And we'll see that again and again. Here we'll see it in Edwin Dickinson. Now that's the only piece we have by Edwin Dickinson. And it's obviously a study. It's a beautiful, but that is not typical of what his painting was. Edwin Dickinson was born in 1891. He came to Provincetown in 1912, again to study with Hawthorne. Beginning in 1937, he basically resided on the Cape, first in Provincetown and later in Wellfleet. His work, now these are pieces that, now when I downloaded that, I thought that was upside down, but it isn't. Now this is a typical thing of what Dickinson did. Very fluid, very kind of not surreal as much as it is. Kind of he kind of straddled certain genres, 19th century American Romantic traditions, and certainly more inventive European traditions. And he was, you know, he did a lot of landscapes that were much more representational, and obviously, as you could see, he could draw. That nude is beautiful. And here's another piece by him. And again, look at what he's done there. There's the central figure who has, you know, playing a musical instrument, and he's kind of put all this context around it, all this kind of clutter, which is a really very interesting painting. He was very, very important in Provincetown. There was a show a couple of years ago at PAM of his work. Lifelong, really very important. in the Provincetown art colony. Very, very active. This is Garrett Han Dias. And remember last week we talked about making form through spot color, shaping color. Well, here you see outlines, and you'll see it in other work, but it's kind of a modernist approach, but it is not creating form just with color. It's drawing, and there's another piece here. Again, this is it's a drawing, it's a print. So, or maybe it's ink. I don't have the so anyway, again, it's drawing. It's not loose. It's very specific. Although it's kind of sketchy. It's not like, okay, let's go look at Carl Knass, and we're going to see. There's a very large piece upstairs that will be interesting. So now, here, Carl Knass was pretty interesting because, unlike so many of the artists that we've talked about, he never went to Europe. He studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, and he was there as I guess he was earning a little extra money, as a museum guard when the Armory show from New York came to Chicago. And he saw this modernist work in the Armory show, and he was so struck by it. And so his influence was not like going to Paris, studying in the Académie Julian, learning from what was happening in pre-World War I. He did it kind of by, through the Armory show and talking to other artists. So here you see a piece, and then this is a woodcut, and he learned the woodcut from. He eventually married the sister of Agnes Weinrich, who we talked about, and Helen Weinrich, who was a pianist, and Agnes taught him the white line woodcut. So he learned a lot, kind of through other artists, but not actually going to. This is very large, and as you can see, abstract. We could talk about this in terms of when we were talking about Hoffman upstairs. As far as I know, he did not study with Hoffman. And do we see anything in this painting?
There's a human figure in it. With a foot.
The cutest.
On the lower right, you see a leg, a foot, I think.
A horse.
How many people see it? It's interesting. How many people see it as abstract? And how many people really want to just find something familiar in it? Most of us do, don't we? Makes us more comfortable, doesn't it? Now I look at that painting and I don't see. You point out the foot, but I didn't see it before.
And the horse.
I was
The
here
horse.
on
And this back
2
end
days
of the
ago
horse.
with some friends from New
Or
York,
something.
and we were
Yeah.
looking at this among many of the other pieces on this. I didn't see that when I saw it, when I looked at it.
Oh, they pointed it out.
No, I just saw it now.
Oh, you just saw it
It may
now.
not, it may not be that's what it is, but it just struck me.
What did he call this painting?
Flight from Egypt?
What is it called? Flight from Egypt?
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah,
I think
that is.
there's a
I think I
donkey
see an
involved.
animal on it, so.
Years.
I mean, I can only see a still life if I really want to scrutinize it. And there's a kind of a table there and maybe a vase, but you see, it's not important to me. It's kind of the way, and when we go upstairs, we can see it, because it's very large. We can see how he spotted the colors. And do we like this painting?
Yeah.
It's pretty well balanced if we look at colors and shapes, and we can, but let's do it upstairs, because I think we can see, it's very, well, it's probably as big as that upstairs, right? And he did this. These are all, by the way, the collection we have of Carl Knass is pretty good. The museum has a really good collection. And look at this one. Now, there is a still life there, isn't there?
Yes.
but it's almost like a collage. She's kind of put, it's not, but it's almost like a collage. He's put together those pieces. I mean, there's the bottle and the cheese, and then like a factory, and that's, I think, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, I think the museum is very fortunate to have that piece. It's a really good piece. And it's not very big. I mean, that's much bigger than what you're getting. And this is another one. In terms of a good collection of Knass, the museum has a really good collection. Very representative of his work. And how much of a modernist he was, and he didn't go to Paris. He learned all this. He was, his patron was, at the time, was Duncan Phillips from the Phillips collection. So, and the Phillips collection gave him a one-person exhibit in 1929. He, born in 1891 and died in 1971. Okay, talk about realism. This is R.H. Ives Gamble, who also spent many years in Provincetown, 50 summers, I think. He did go to Paris. He was exposed to modernism. Knass, on the other hand, didn't, but it never took hold with Gamble. He was an academic painter. The two pieces that are in the collection are from, he did a 23-panel Hound of Heaven series from the Francis Thompson's poem, Hound of Heaven, which is a story of religious conversion. And this is very typical of his work. Very exacting, very academic. He was a great admirer of William McGregor Paxton, who we saw last week. But he was not an impressionist. He was clearly academic. He was very interested in religious paintings and paintings that had kind of related to either religion or myths. Yes?
His training, you mentioned he was in France for a while?
Yes.
Did he go to school in the States as well, or?
Let me see, did he? Yes, he would have. Oh, he studied with Paxton and at the Boston Museum School. So, but he studied in Paris, but it never hit. It never caught on for him. He was a, Robert Douglas Hunter studied with Gamble, and in fact, Bob talked about it. He first studied with Henshey, and Henshey basically was an impressionist, and it's my way or the highway. I don't want you to do anything else. Very different from Hoffman and very different from Hawthorne. And so after Bob studied with Henshey for a while, although Bob was a realist, he then went on to study with Gamble, both in Provincetown. So even somebody like Bob Hunter, who was, a realist painter, felt, and Bob told me this, felt kind of locked in because Henshey really wouldn't allow much movement away from what he felt was the only, as far as he was concerned, anything after Impressionism, and he even said this to me, was junk. He didn't like it. He was angry man because he, I actually interviewed a lot of students who all, except for Hilda Neely, who all said the same thing. He was passed over more or less, and the art that was happening, went beyond Impressionism, and he just really didn't. He was very angry. He felt rejected, I guess. And I didn't get to meet him until he was a pretty old man. And he was, I did a film way back in the 80s a documentary that was on PBS on the art colony, and I interviewed a lot of artists who talked about their work and the art colony. And one of them was Henshey, and Henshey is on the film, but when it was the director who edited the film, and it was edited in New York, and he was doing it based on, you know, the film and, you know, his idea of the aesthetics of the film. But the interview I had with Henshey, he was so angry that the poor guy ended up on the cutting room floor. You see him in the film walking around. He had an outdoor class, but you don't hear him. And I remember,
Once again.
you know, the director just didn't want to have anything to do with putting him on the film. He was just so angry. This is George Grosz. This is a really unusual painting. It's the only thing we have in the collection. George Grosz was born in 1893. He was German, and he became part of and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Dada Group. He became part of the Dada Group, and I'll give you some background on that arose after the end of World War I, when there were a group of artists and writers who were very angry and opposed to the brutality, the lives that were lost during World War I. And they met in Zurich and formed this group that was kind of anti-art. Basically, they said conventional art if conventional art led us to the brutality of World War I, we don't want it. And they came up with this idea of anti-art, that art could be anything. And I'm going to show you some examples of that, which of course are not in the museum collection, but I thought I would add something about that, because Grosz was connected to it. Now, he left Germany in 1932, just as Hitler was coming into power, and he taught at the Art Students League. And he did some of these landscapes which are kind of surreal, they're kind of odd, and this is the only piece of his we have in the collection. As far as I know, he had no connection to Provincetown. But here is an example, typically, of what he was painting. And it was satiric, it was cynical of these people, you know, from the, you know, after the war, the businessmen, they were all kind of fat, and you see the soldiers back here. And this is an example of the type of work he was doing. Now, he was associated with the Dada movement, and this gives you an example. Dada came up with this idea, and no one really knows how the name came up. Dada in French means hobby horse, and in Russian it means yes, yes. A lot of people feel and this is what they were doing, they kind of went through a dictionary and then pointed, or you know, some letters, and this is how Dada. No one really knows what it means, except what they stood for, which was anti-art. They felt that the aesthetics of art wasn't as important as the message. And the idea was to use materials not always associated typically with art. And collage and assemblages became part of what they did. And here's another piece. And you see Dada, and you see this, and this is a collage of pieces. And if you want to look at it, it really says a lot. But here is Man Ray, and that is Dada. An iron with spikes in it. What does that say?
Don't iron.
Don't iron. And it's funny, but that's what they were doing. And of course, probably the most famous Dadaist was Marcel Duchamp, and that's the urinal. So they were taking what they called ready-mades things, you know, he probably got this iron and put these spikes into it, and, you know, that's a real urinal. So it wasn't just, that's kind of what they were doing. And they were saying, basically, that art can be anything. And as we go further on, when we look at pop art, with Warhol and that whole movement, art could be a seriograph, a silk screen of Elizabeth Taylor, or it could be flags. We have Jasper Johns coming up. Flags, or it could be targets, it could be anything from, and it was like a comment on our mass culture in the 50s and the 60s. Well, actually probably more like the 60s, when Warhol and his group came on the scene. And they were basically saying anything can be art. Even what we would look at is commercial Campbell soup cans were art. And by the way, they're selling for millions of dollars today. So I just thought I'd introduce Dada just a little bit, just so you had a sense of... This Vernon Smith, I didn't, you know, Dee and I talked about some of the discoveries we found when we were working on the collection. Now, I never knew this artist. And I think they're going to have a show of his work. And think how modern. Now, he was born in 1894, died in 1969. He was head of the, he was a regional director with the WPA. And, but very, I mean, this is very Cubist. He's pretty modern in terms of his work. He lived in Orleans. He worked as a craftsman. And he repaired furniture and made sconces, and he actually taught in the Orleans public schools. And he's in the Museum of Modern Art and the Smithsonian. And, you know, I guess I should have known about him, but there's some really nice pieces that these are all in the museum collection. Now, both of those are representational. Flat, layered, really have a sense of the faceting of Cubism, the boats. It's a wonderful painting, as is that. And you know, some of these artists, he's certainly not a household name, but he did some remarkably good work. And then he ended up doing these, in 1946 he began wood carvings, and we have some of those upstairs. And again, these are kind of bas-reliefs, carved wood, very modern for that time. Another one, kind of a totem. So good collection, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be an exhibition of his work coming up. So it's interesting to see somebody like Carl Knass and somebody like Gamel, and you know, compare the two. And I love the thing that Knass never went to Europe, but Gamel did, and it somehow didn't take. This is Sol Wilson, also connected to Provincetown. He was Paul Rezica's first teacher. His work was expressionistic, representational, and he studied with people from the Ashcan school, George Bellows, Robert Henry. Part of there was a group called the Eight, or the Ashcan school, John Sloan. And, but his work is very different. It's an expressionistic realist. That's in quotes. That was from what he said. And when we go upstairs, you're going to see his brushstroke and the thickness of the paint. Here's another piece by him. These two are in the collection, and this one I just added. I downloaded it because it looked like Provincetown. And he was connected to Provincetown. Am I going too fast? Stop me.
The one before was Provincetown. The one with the railroad sidings. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
yes.
Provincetown.
And that certainly looks like
That's
Provincetown.
Provincetown too.
Dark colors, he didn't use you don't see a lot of that light.
Mm.
It's,
It was like the weather today.
Yeah.
yeah. And it reminds me a little bit of German Expressionism. Not the kind of Matisse Expressionism. The German Expressionism was dark and kind of like this, but French was much lighter and airier, you know, and probably the difference of the personalities and the culture itself. Okay, we have two portraits by Ripley, Aidan Lassell Ripley. He was very much part of the Boston training. And I know Dee Dee would love to have some of his work that isn't. Here's Ripley as a young man, and these are self-portraits, and here he is as an older man. Nicely painted, a little more, maybe, you can see kind of the kind of looks like an abstract painting or maybe an undercoating of a painting. But he also did a lot of birds and wildlife. And here's a pretty typical work by him that's not in the collection. The last two works are not in the collection. The only pieces in the collection are the two portraits. And it has a lot of light and a lot of energy. It's kind of impressionistic. It's a watercolor. And this is what he did. He painted, beside those portraits that we have, he painted kind of everyday life. He painted children sledding in Boston's public garden, or people waiting for a train, or a snow-covered village, or just a little town and people very quiet every day. That was the kinds of things he painted. Arnold Geisbuehler, really important to the museum. He was born in Switzerland. Got to know Giacometti, one of the very famous sculptors, and he made his way eventually to Cape Cod. And he gave a large donation of his work to the museum. He is the father of Miranda, who married Harry Hall. So there's that connection. He started out, as you can see, as a realist. And you could see these pieces. But he moved on. And that's upstairs.
Mm-hmm.
He worked in ceramics. So anyway, he first came to the United States in 1928 with, he married Elizabeth Chase, who was a sculpture student whom he met in Paris. And he exhibited his work at the Whitney Studio in New York, and he spent time in Boston and Cape Cod. And his work more and more became, as we will see, and certainly as a cubist, that reminds me of a Matisse sculpture. Compare that with the first, those portraits. A lot of art, it's interesting. A lot of people will look at art like this and say, well, they don't know what they're doing. They didn't know how to do it, so they did that. Or they did this. But if you look at, for example, Picasso's early work, when he was like 12 or 14, he was painting like as good as Rembrandt. he was so wonderful. But a lot of artists feel like, and as we get more into modernism, really feel they want to go beyond. A lot of that had to do with photography. When that became, in the latter part of the 19th century, there was a feeling, certainly it influenced a lot of artists, that you could easily duplicate a scene, a photograph, I mean a person, anything, with a photograph. So when we think about Sargent and how much time he spent painting a portrait, well, you could, do it very quickly with a camera. So there was this interest in moving beyond the reality that could be so easily duplicated with photography. And I think that might have been one of the motivations for artists to try new things. And you see this with Geisbuehler, with those early busts that he did, but then he did these things. These are all in, there's a very large collection of his work here, because he gave it on. And there are figures here. Can we see them?
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, he knew Giacometti, so eventually he became more and more influenced by Giacometti. And he was, in 1964, he was part of an exhibition in Paris that included the work of Giacometti. So, and they were both Swiss. This is the only piece we have by Alexander Calder, and as far as I know, I can't find any connection that he had to the Cape. But he is world famous, and we have this print. It's either a litho or... so I thought what I would do is give you a little background on him and show you what he's really known for, which is that. Mm-hmm. And we have that Arthur Bowman upstairs, which certainly is replicated. So Calder developed these mobiles where he would just use sheet metal and wire. But when you think about it, it required a lot of engineering when it hangs. And of course it moves with air currents. So it is a mobile. And he used these discs. Sometimes he used organic shapes that, but, and he always used these kind of bright colors. And and there's a very famous piece in the Whitney, his circus. He worked, he was a freelance artist for the National Police Gazette, and he sketched the circus. And he came up with the idea of constructing these animals. I don't know if it's not always on exhibit at the Whitney, but there's this wonderful arrangement of these little animals and a kind of a miniature circus. And some people believe that that's how he developed the ability to balance and was kind of a step toward doing the mobiles, which came later. He was, is there an artist that someone would say would have inspired Calder?
Was it Matisse, I think?
Well, color, yeah,
And,
certainly.
Who was it? It was
Mondrian, certainly.
Yeah.
He also did a lot of gouaches, which are paintings. He did a lot of prints. He was prolific. And certainly his work was, as far as I know, always abstract. He did these stables. And this is in Chicago. Here's another mobile. This is very typical of his gouaches. And this is in New York City. You probably passed it by, it's near the IBM building. Very strong. How do we relate these to the mobiles? Does anyone?
This movement.
There is even movement in these, yeah.
Balance and
Geometric shape.
Yes.
balance.
And even in the even in a painting like this is probably a gouache. Think about the movement there. And think about how he's blocked in those colors and those shapes. If we think about Hoffman and push-pull. The red keeps spotting, the yellow keeps moving. Only one blue though. But how it brings you in again, and that spiral.
Deborah, isn't there a place in Philadelphia where you can stand and see a sculpture by his grandfather, his father, and him?
Oh, Calder?
Yes, Calder.
Oh.
There is, and I'm not sure, it must be in front of some museum. There's a place where
Ben
you can
Franklin
see the
Parkway.
3 generations of,
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I should know that, because I'm
I
from
should, I
Philadelphia.
can't remember, I know it, but I know the fact that
Yeah.
I can't remember.
I'm gonna be going there.
Yeah, me
in
too.
a little while.
Giant.
I'll do some research, let you know. Okay? Because I'm not that familiar with it. Okay, this is another Vernon Coleman. Again, he was he was on Cape Cod, a marine painter for the most part. When I was doing the book, I was very committed to making sure I included the major collections where the artists were represented. And about 100 of the 121 in the book are included in major museum collections. But Coleman, I couldn't find in any collections. But he is a local artist. And that's a very nice seascape.
Very nice.
What?
Very nice. The condemnation of nice.
It doesn't move you a lot, right? Me neither. Which is probably why I couldn't find that he's in any major collections. Some of this work is just, it's been done before. But he was, he actually was an assistant stage manager in 1927 for the inaugural season of the Cape Playhouse. And he also worked at he was a set designer for the Barnstable Comedy Club. So he has a strong Cape connection. Here's a really interesting artist, Javier Gonzalez. Very strange painting, huh? It's called Meditation at Patmos. Not my favorite of his work. Now there's quite a good collection at the museum of Gonzalez's work, and he had definitely a connection to the Cape. We're going to see some of his Wellfleet paintings, and he had a school in Wellfleet that he ran for a decade until the early 70s. So he had a definite connection with the Cape. That is certainly a seascape, but it's pretty abstract. Lots of movement in his work. He's an expressionist but really very singular style, I find. Faceted, beautiful shapes. Really, really original in so many ways. I mean, compare that with that. Same kind of subject matter, right? And when we think about that, lots of movement there. The way the sails kind of, and he's done all this faceting of the colors. It feels very spontaneous to me. This is, again, think about those facets of light, and I would call that semi-abstract. There's a sense of boats and water, but this is Chinese junks. I love that painting. You can go upstairs and this is Claire Layton. She did wood engravings. She was born in London, and she studied in London, and that's where she learned wood engraving, which is a relief. We think of the white line woodcuts, and we think of woodcuts or wood block prints. This again is wood engraving is a surface print. So you're cutting away the wood, so all of the white is where you cut away. And what's left, you ink. And she was she ran around sketching, and then she brought this back to her studio. This is, I think, a beautiful, not necessarily typical of her work. There are a couple of other pieces in the collection that are, but think of the quality of that, and the movement in that, and how she's the reverberated, and the hands, lots of feet. There's another person back there somewhere. But she, oftentimes what she did was do the rural, very interested in the rural setting, and this is this wind-blown tree. Again, how much she's captured movement. These are wood engravings, okay, so she's gouging the wood. She also did these plates, and one of her subject matters was workers, people working hard. And I think they're pretty dramatic for black and white. I think as we go through this, and we talked about that one painting, the kind of quiet seaside painting, and we should talk a little bit about how some paintings kind of leave you cold, and other paintings really, you feel some emotion, some feeling. I think Claire Layton, there's a nostalgia certainly about that piece, of what it must have been like. They're the ice cutters, right? There's another piece here too. Again, how she's captured that movement. So you really get a sense, now these are plates. So you really get a sense of, and she probably did the designs for the plates. They're not wood engravings, and they were.
It's a transfer print. When you think of the detail that she has, and the fact that that had to go from a piece of paper really into a concave,
Right.
It's astonishing to me that it's a.
Yeah, and she probably didn't execute the plates,
Yeah.
she just did the drawing.
Yeah.
But she would have done the wood engravings.
Yeah.
So she had she did a lot of, she spent summers in Wellfleet. She wrote and illustrated a lot of books. One was Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. She did in her lifetime about 800 prints, and she illustrated 65 books, so she was pretty busy. She created a design for Steuben glass and Wedgwood. And you know, beside that, what else did she do? Stained glass windows for churches in New England and the Worcester Cathedral in England. The ceramic plates, the ice cutting one, and this one is whaling. And I guess you see the whale right there.
Yeah.
And she's in like the British Museum and Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Institute. I just, you know, now, for example, I've seen some of this work at the museum, but I wasn't familiar with her work. And Dee Dee and I were talking about our discoveries when we went through the collection. And there were people like Vernon Smith that I discovered, and another guy, Thomas Eastwood, which we'll look at later. Here's another piece by her.
Wow.
Hands. How she decided to focus on that. Now, look how big that is. You know how big it is upstairs? It's like this big. Reginald Marsh, really important painter. He was known for his scenes of New York during the Depression and later on. But New York was his, New York was put on his canvases. He was actually, which is kind of interesting, he was born in Paris to affluent parents, but he ended up painting these kind of ordinary scenes of New York, and during the Depression, he did this piece, and this subway piece, and look at the faces. I mean, you really feel the Depression there, don't you? He was an illustrator for the New York Daily News and the New Yorker magazine. He studied with the Ashcan School of Painters. The Ashcan School were a group of painters in the early part of this century who were representational, but they kind of moved away. They weren't specifically modernists, but they moved away from pretty landscapes, and they really wanted to focus on everyday life. Not like the Impressionists did, but they really wanted to focus on everyday life in New York for the most part. And John Sloan, George Bellows, Robert Henry, very important in that, and they were also called the Eight, and they exhibited. And Reginald Marsh was very influenced by them. He took up painting in 1923, and he sketched and photographed the people on the streets, on the subway. Now, these pieces are not in the collection. But, the usherette. Does that remind you of anybody else's painting?
Edward Han.
Yeah.
Well, subject matter, not yet.
The subject matter, not the style of painting, no. Again, very kind of loose, nostalgic. Here's another piece. You really get a sense of the time. Henry Henshey. We'll just spend a little time with him. He was Hawthorne's assistant at the Cape Cod School of Art. And he was carried over the tradition of the way that Hawthorne taught, which was one spot of color against another. and that's how important it was to do that. This one is typical. It's a still life as opposed to this, which is outside, and it's close to what a lot of the Hawthorne, the mudheads, although her face is pretty, but you really get a sense of the light. He, I think we've talked about him enough as it is, but he was definitely committed to plein air painting, and he did still lifes and portraits and landscapes, and he never gave up on Impressionism. We have one work by Jack Torkov, which is outside. It's a very small work. And this is another good example of his mudheads. And that, by the way, the man is Bob Henry. So what do we think of Henshey? I guess I haven't said much nice. No, I mean, I think his painting is kind of pretty, I guess. But it's been done before. We're going to get to Jack Torkov, who's really very interesting. And there's one piece outside here, which is a good example of his late work. But that's the only piece we have of his. In 1982, Torkov was having an exhibition at the Guggenheim. And I was lucky enough to go to New York to interview him. And I want to get a picture of him. There he is. Probably younger than when I interviewed him. He was 81 when I interviewed him. He lived on West 23rd Street in Manhattan, and lived there, and he had a studio. And it was he had stayed there. I think it was around March, and March and April, we normally would go to Provincetown. He had a long, very long time in Provincetown. But he stayed there because he was going to have a show at the Guggenheim. However, if we go back to his early work, he was in Provincetown in the 1920s and 1930s. He exhibited at the Provincetown Art Association, and he lobbied there for a more liberal approach, and this is typical of what he was doing. Representational. In 1935, he stopped going, he told me, because we thought it was ruined. That was 1935. Now I'm talking to him in the 80s, and there's a big difference. I wasn't there in 1935, but I would imagine it wasn't ruined the way some people thought it was ruined by the 80s. So he left, and he said, compared to the 70s, the 30s were bucolic, but still he felt it was ruined. Anyway, in 1958, he and his wife came back, and they purchased a house in the West End, and he spent summers there until he died in 1982, when he was 81. He was born in Poland in 1900, and he immigrated to the United States in 1913. I'm going to be focusing as we go on, and I think people here earlier, more and more we're going to find that the artists that are in the book are ones that I've interviewed. And I think it's important and will be more interesting for you, for me to tell you about some of the things they said and how they viewed their art. And it's kind of firsthand. It's not as a result of my research, it's a result of actually meeting meeting these artists. So we're going to do more and more of that, and I may go quickly over some other artists, and if you have the book, you can read about them. But I think it'll be more fun. And Jack Torkov is the first one. Next week, there's Chaim Grosz and Will Barnett that I both interviewed, and lots of times I interviewed these artists when they were quite a bit older. So there was a perspective that they could communicate to me about what they did in their art. So he started out as a figurative artist, and he was interested in Cubism, but in the late 40s, abstract expressionism arrived on the scene, and again, that was after World War II. Things were, you know, America was the great power, and we had the influence of a lot of the European artists who had come to America to get out of Paris when the Nazis occupied. So he got very involved with abstract expressionism, which you can see in the background. That was very typical of him. He reminded me, by the way, and I told him that, he reminded me of Picasso. I don't know if anyone sees a likeness, but...
Oh, yeah.
And I told him that, and he said, oh yeah, other people have told me that, but I don't think so. But he was kind of short, you know, the stature was the same, and he, you know, was, you could see there seemed to be for me, it was kind of interesting. So he was very much part of the abstract expressionist scene, doing these very gestural works, as you can see, and part of the whole scene. And he said, you know, he had a studio next to de Kooning in New York, and he painted with Karl Knaus and Franz Klein, and he said, he described the post-war America as euphoric. And I remember him telling me, at that time, he said, all the artists working in New York, and there were probably many, he said, you could have fit them in the Cedar Tavern, which is where they used to hang out in the Village. He said, now you'd need Yankee Stadium for the artists that are working today. So it was in some ways a rather small group of artists, relatively speaking. So he was very much involved in abstract expressionism, but came from this kind of work, and that's Provincetown. So we'll see, I mean, you saw it in Geisbuehler. You'll see it in how artists go through these various stages and kind of get beyond. Some artists are abstract and go back to figurative work. So it's kind of interesting. So he taught a lot, and he had a show at the Baltimore Museum of Art in the 50s, and he also was at Black Mountain College, which is no more in North Carolina. He expressed, he was very much involved in that spirit. It must have been, you know, if people want to talk about if they want to go back to a certain time, and the Woody Allen Midnight in Paris wanted to go back to Paris in the 20s after World War I with Gertrude Stein et al. And I can imagine the 50s in New York with what was happening post-World War II, when things were, the country was rebuilding and there was all this excitement. And the abstract expressionists were building momentum. And he said it was a very exciting time. He called it a heady spirit to be involved. And certainly those pieces, I couldn't, when you're downloading pieces, sometimes, Benton and they come up this small, so they're not good to project. And I couldn't get any of his abstract work that was big enough, but then I found this piece, which gives you a sense of what his abstract work was. So he then, I'll go back, evolved to something like this, which is representative of his late work. he had a retrospective in 1964 at the Whitney, and around that time, he made some decisions about the abstract expressionism. And he said he thought, and this is a quote, he characterized it as unreasonable nihilistic attitudes, very much personal, your personal, I mean, he felt the artists were expressing their personal angst, their personal emotion. And so, and yet he said he had very warm feelings about the period. He said, "It was the only time in my life when I was a member of a group drawn together by aesthetic ideas, and at the same time we were also close friends." And that first group of abstract expressionists, all of whom, that first generation, was in Provincetown at one time or another. Motherwell, Klein, Rothko, Gottlieb, Pollock even was there. De Kooning, they were all there at one time. And Torcup was there. So he makes his change, and he becomes chairman of the art department at Yale. And he said he began searching for a structure. And I want to read you some of his quotes because I think they're really interesting. He said, "I didn't want a painting that was so personal. I wanted a painting that had elements outside myself." And abstract expressionism was a very personal, spontaneous, emotional expression. He said, by focusing on geometry, he was hoping to tap into universality. And when I spent time with this man, who was this kind of quiet, very modest man, this work seemed suited to his personality rather than that abstract expressionist work. It seemed like he had found his personality. Maybe he had caught up with abstract expressionism, but here he felt grounded here. So he reduced everything to these mathematical formulas, and he worked on a grid. And then you see all these wonderful shapes and triangles. At first, he was doing black and white. But he said, and that helped him to clarify what he was doing. But then he said, he started using color, he said, partly because the audience liked it. And he said, there's a way of using color for its own sake, for its pleasure. I always tend to color for structure. So if we go back and look at that. The color is for structure. And as controlled as it is, there is a lot of movement in it. And you get the movement. Of course, he has this grid, which is horizontal, vertical, but then he slashes it with these diagonals. And color has an emotional aspect, as, you know, we talked about this last week. You know, red gives you a sense of more excitement, blue is kind of quiet, green, you know, people respond to color. But certainly line also. So a horizontal line, and we think of that as landscapes, is quiet for the most part. A vertical line has more energy. And a diagonal line has a lot more. And if we think about that, you could see it in here. And how he's played with these various shapes. So he went on to say that the grid helped him establish specific relationships, suggesting shapes to pursue. But they were limited by the diagonals that he drew within the grid. So the grid is there, all the straight lines, and then think of all the shapes he created with the diagonals. He said he preferred limits that the grid set on his work, but it still allowed him, he said, infinite choices. He said, the original grid from which you work is like the sea from which you fish. And what comes up is often by accident. So the grid doesn't eliminate randomness. It doesn't eliminate choice, but it puts some kind of form on what you do. So he went on to say, and here he's talking about art, which I think makes a lot of sense. And he said, when he was searching for a word to describe his approach, he settled on the word justness. And he said, no unnecessary exaggeration. For him, the field of action was the rectangle. It was about geometry, he said, and about Cézanne. And here's a quote. He said, Cézanne didn't make beautiful paintings. He made true paintings. By comparison, other painters have made beautiful paintings, but not true paintings. A true painting like Cézanne stays with you a long time. So there's beauty, but it's a different kind of beauty. And several other artists are talking about, one being Motherwell and one being Helen Frankenthaler. We don't have any work by her, but she did talk about that, about what a true painting is. That, and he's saying what a true painting is stays with you a long time. It reverberates. It's, you know, and again, this is subjective. He goes on to say, as an abstract painter, you're continually involved in ideas that are quite aside from the things that you see. It's a kind of mental and emotional process that goes on that is quite regardless of what you see. So he said, I asked him, I think at this point, did Provincetown have any influence on him? And he said, I can't really say that the paintings I paint in Provincetown are any different from the paintings I paint in New York. A lot of the things I paint are evolving over a long period of time, quite regardless of where he is. He also, although when you look at a piece like this, you think, oh, well, he's very much into his head, it's very intellectual, it's geometric. But he wasn't an ivory, tower painter. He had a, as you would have guessed, he was a liberal and had a strong social consciousness. And he said the art of the time, he says, is often influenced by the social and economic period and also reflects it. He said, but he was at a loss to explain how abstract art reflected that period. Although when I think about it, I think it did represent the excitement, the energy, the rebuilding after the war. So I think it did in many ways. But he said, I doubt very much if the Impressionist painters were at all aware of the fact that they were celebrating the triumph of the middle class. Because if you remember, that was one of the commitments of the Impressionists. They wanted to paint the world around them, the people around them, everyday life. And so he's saying he's not sure that that's what they actually were doing, but he thinks that that's what they were doing. So he, and here's some interesting stuff. He was troubled about the artists in his time, in the 80s, who gear their work only for the marketplace. He said they're selling out. And there's a great deal of art which is purely attention-seizing, purely name-making. And he recognized that there's a pressure to invent, to come up with something new. And all along, when we even go back to Picasso, whatever, it's going beyond that seascape that we saw that everybody kind of said ho-hum about. So it's about doing something different. But Tworkov is saying, attention may be given to something new and startling, but that doesn't mean it's good art. Now today, when we look at some of the art, and I think we all have our personal opinions, and people are doing all kinds of things that are quote-unquote new, and in the marketplace selling for astronomical prices, and yet, is it good art? And, you know, somebody that's spending millions of dollars for a Jeff Koons, I guess thinks it's good art. Or maybe that person is just like buying it like a stock on the market. Things. But he had some really important things to say about that. And he said he was aware that he had social and political concerns, he said, but he didn't think his work expressed it. And he thought the Impressionists weren't aware that maybe what their work was expressing was kind of a celebration of the middle class. And then he said wistfully, not realizing how much time he had left, but aware that he was 81, that time was bound to be short. And he said, if I could look forward to a long period of work, and if I could know how, if I could introduce social comment, which I think the Dadists did, into my work without sacrificing what I believe is art, I would gladly do it. And then after a moment he added, but I can't very much express it in my work unless I took to writing. On my canvases, which is a possibility, it's sometimes I've considered for a long time. But he never did, because soon after the show, he came to the Cape, to Provincetown, and he died in Provincetown. Soon after I had interviewed him, so I was able to get that interview in before. And he was very, you know, you meet artists and some are nice and some aren't, but he was a nice man. He was a kind of guy I would have liked to have gotten to know a little bit better. I know, am I wild about his art, but I really like that piece a lot. So, before we go upstairs, I want to give us about a half an hour. There's a tour cup right out there in front. But I want to give us about a half an hour because I think it was really good to gather around a painting and really look at, not just at an image, so. And there is but is there any questions or anything else people want to talk to me about? Maybe, could we put lights up? Yep, so I can see people. So, we saw a lot. Anybody have anything they want to share with the rest of us?
Did you say anything, I can't remember what you said about Calder's connection to the Cape?
None.
None.
As far as I
None.
know, yes, it had not.
Cape, no.
Although years and years ago, I went to some sort of reception that his wife was there in Osterville, in this fabulous place. He went to the Stevens Institute of Technology, that's where Calder went, in New Jersey. And I think it was the president of the university. There was some sort of, and Calder wasn't alive anymore, but his wife was there, and they gave her something, some sort of award or something. And they had this big reception, and I went there, but Calder wasn't there. I couldn't find any connection that Calder was here. He may have been, you know, slipped in and slipped out, it's possible. I know we're going to talk about Jamie Wyeth at the very end because he's one of the younger artists. And I interviewed him, and he said when he goes up to Maine, he actually lives in Rockwell Kent's house. Excuse me. So I said to him, have you ever seen the mural at the Cape Cinema? And he said, only pictures of it, I've never been there. So from his mouth, I know Jamie Wyeth has never been on Cape Cod. And I had talked to him, he had a show in Boston a couple of years ago, and then they had a small Wyeth show at the Heritage Museum. But he was at the press opening at the MFA, and I remember asking him then, and so there is no connection. I think the mission of collecting at the museum is now expanded so that they're looking for art, not just from artists who had a connection to the Cape, but you know, certainly a lot of these artists influenced artists on the Cape or were, you know, one way or the other. So I think there's a broadening of you know, the idea of a collection. Whereas the Provincetown Museum collection, I think, is pretty well centered on the art colony. But there were also so many very famous artists there that, you know, they could build a collection that way. Anybody else?
I noticed one of your Dada's collages, I think it was, looked a lot like a shepherd fairy. I was just wondering whether or not.
Which one?
The one that it kind of had like these rays coming out.
Yes,
and there was
right.
Right? Did that look like the shepherd fairy exhibition they had at the IC?
It could be,
I
yeah.
thought there was just a lot in common there. I was just wondering maybe if.
Yeah, you know, when
speaking
I
of
pull these
drawing
things
on-
off the internet, sometimes you can't identify them by the artist, which is kind of interesting. You know, you'll do a search for Dada, and you get, and clearly that was Dada because their name was there. But I mean, I knew the Man Ray, the Iron, and I knew the Duchamp. But lots of times, the internet search, you don't really find how, you know.
Yeah, well, that might be an example of how somebody on Cape influenced somebody who maybe has never come to the Cape.
Oh,
You
yeah.
see what I mean? Because the two seem so similar. To
Oh,
each other.
okay,
So
yeah.
I'm
Oh,
just
yeah,
wondering
and
whether he had
clearly,
studied them.
Varadjan Bogosian, who we'll be talking about later, and there's a large number of pieces here in this collection, was definitely influenced by Dada, and you can see in his work. Kind of the humor, the kind of little bit of a satire, the anti-art, because a lot of what Bogosian used in his art were found objects, which was certainly what Dada was saying. Anything can be art, absolutely anything.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So I kind of brought that in because of George Grosz, and because he was connected to Dada, and I just thought, and I've always been interested in Dada, so I did a little research and found those pieces. Anybody else? So we're all going to kind of trace upstairs. First, let's stop at there's a tour card. Right out here. Look at that. Well, here's the tour card. I didn't.
Oh, I see, yeah, oh, that's different.
No, it's a grant. And so it's probably in the background. Oh, really? The shading is probably the grant.
No, I think that's a really good point.
So the litho is probably, could have been the grid itself. It's okay. No, not at all. The shading, I guess. Because it says
It could be a color.
it's very representative of Torcog, and it's good that we have that piece because it's not an early piece, but I know they would love to have some pieces with color, you know, like that one big one, and that's probably some of that, you know, it's a picture music. And then you could look at, well, there's an and did we talk about, excuse me. Like we're just choosing. Oh, Paxton, that was last week. So, well, why don't we meet upstairs, in front, in the lobby, there's a Geissbuehler. Okay? Okay, yep. I sent it out.
Illustration and art.
Okay.
And that
You think? Okay. So then the first artist that we talked about, he was an illustrator. He was out to scientifically document the birds of America. Was he an artist or an illustrator? And Norman Rockwell. A lot of people felt he was an illustrator.
But an illustrator is an artist, but not all artists are illustrators. Yeah, it's not.
And
There you go. Give the illustrator his due.
But early on, and not all illustrators in the museum in Rhode Island, which is a jewel, if you've ever been there. All the major artists are in there because early on, most of the major artists' work was reproduced in magazines and publications because that's the only way people saw them. So, and so they were classified as illustrators.
Yeah, Edward Hopper.
Such as NC
That's
Wyeth.
right.
So where do you draw the line? For example, Norman Rockwell was always kind of put down as an illustrator, but now people are saying, no. He was a pretty good artist. We're not talking about the technical ability, which he obviously had, but his subject matter, what he told us about, we're talking about the impression, what he told us about everyday life.
But in a way, you could classify Edwin Ripley because he was noted for his sports magazine, nature things, and the stamps that he did for the government, nature, his replication of animals, and they're lately because anyone who illustrated books, their mission, they were paid to come up with an illustration for a book. Now, whether they did that in woodcut or painting or a painting that was reproduced in a book that, someone else you mentioned they had
Yes, right.
Yeah. Now, we don't think of her as an illustrator.
No,
Clearly.
Yeah. And then there'll be a whole course on what is art, or what is fine.
That's a good question.
Art, like Fran said, illustration, images is whatever, but what is quote unquote fine art? Art that belongs in a museum. And that's like, art is so subjective, and today,
Anything goes.
In olden days, they said that. That's a song. Okay, here's that.
So there are a couple here.
Is this the Depression one?
Here's your
Oh, that is small. This one is
But talk about, it's a little painting, but talk about how it really says something about.
It's wonderful. Now that's an etching.
That reminds me a little bit of Henry Moore's work who did the undergrounds and after the war.
Oh, right.
And he had these really emotional.
And that certainly is.
But these people are recording history, and that's critical.
Yeah.
And since we're visual learners, that's the way most of us learn.
Yes, right. So for somebody that was born.
In a sense, it's an illustration in a way.
Yeah.
It's telling a story, right? It's narrative.
Right, so there are paintings, we were talking about the narrative aspects of painting. Here's the Benton one that we have, which is a lithograph, which means usually there's no number on that. Usually lithographs were done, they're multiples, they could be done over and over again. Oftentimes they're numbered, but this one isn't. And that is, and some of the other pieces. And look at how, the sculptural aspect of those figures. And he started out as a sculptor. So here is the knack.
And I really like this, and I only noticed the title.
What is it? Spike White?
And I never noticed it.
I'm seeing it, and I'm going to
There's a New Testament story.
that's what the reference is.
Looks to me.
I never saw the foot.
I was sitting-
Like two people, like one behind the other.
Yeah, that's what we're doing.
That looks like a doorway, like an escape.
Yeah.
That's probably.
I don't know, we don't know, and a lot of artists really feel
I'm always
like
looking for a new.
people read into it something they never even thought of. And which is part of what art is. It is communicating in a very personal way, if you want to walk by it, and it doesn't mean anything to you. But it is communicating in a very personal way. And you could put your own stamp on it, more or less, and say, okay, this is what it means to me.
I personally don't need a narrative or anything familiar. When I look at abstract art, I am just interested in the composition, the color, the movement, how it works for me in a very personal way. I don't look for anything in it, but that's me. So other people feel differently.
He had a long career. You know, over the course of his career, was it mostly abstract?
No, it was, and there's another small one, I think it's in the other room, it's not the one, that one too, but I call it. And it has some of how he spots a color and how it continues to move, and look at the variety of shapes. And the hand of the artist. I mean, this is an exact, you know. There's a lot of white canvas underneath, sketching.
You mentioned he was from Chicago. What was his connection to the Cape?
No, I think he's from the Midwest, but he studied at the Art Institute.
Right.
And that was when he saw the, he was a guard, a museum guard there. And that was when he saw the Armory show.
But what is his connection to Cape Cod?
Oh, Provincetown. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. He was in Provincetown a long time.
Okay.
Yeah, oh, a strong connection with Provincetown. In fact, I think from the time, whenever he went there, maybe in the 20s, he was there just about the rest of his life.
Okay.
And he married Agnes Weinrich's sister. And I think Agnes and he married Helen Weinrich. The three of them lived together in Provincetown. So, yeah, no, he had a very strong connection with Provincetown. And fortunately, we have, the museum has a good collection of his work.
Yeah.
There's a couple of pieces. I know there's one of the
I think this is
Yes.
And then that was Forman. This is council care public auction.
We like it.
It looks like there's more to it than the
Yes,
person.
exactly.
Well, that's why it's cool that they're made.
The murals at the Cage, murals at Barnstable High School, and the caves that they sort of uncovered recently.
Yes, right. It's, I don't know, when does he do it? Is it here tonight?
The cardboard is still up, sun cardboard.
It's amazing.
So here is Gonzalez. Oh, yes, you're right. Yes. Yeah, you're right. I didn't see that he was influenced by Feynman, but Donald Stoltenberg.
Yeah, his that same,
Yeah.
Looks
I
like
think that's a wonderful idea.
looks like he might use a palette knife, possibly, right?
Well, it's a watercolor.
Pretty.
So how do you know, I mean, artists today paint on in various ways.
Right.
With their fingers.
I mean, white.
The white,
Varies in
yeah,
white. It
he-
looks like it's maybe just.
Watercolor can be thick too.
Yes, right, yeah, right, without mixing it.
Right.
Yeah. And here is that Merlin Smith, which is, I think, a really nice discovery. Real
Talk,
cubist.
talk about discovery. They found one in Hyannis last year, right?
Was it, oh, was this, it was
It was
him,
Vernon
yeah,
Smith,
right, yeah.
right? It was under a
Right, yeah, they were redoing a restaurant or something.
right.
Yeah, mural, yeah.
And they can see.
Yeah, yeah.
So then we get someone concerned with somebody came in.
It was on Main Street.
I think they were going to.
Oh, here's the road.
Yeah, because they decided to stay.
Now, talk about oil and canvas, look at the texture. And look at how these shells, look at how he's created all of this. The nails. It's a very strange, it's a strange painting, very strange. And not at all characteristic of what he's mostly known for, which I showed you that one. He was the Dada
It is like a sort of,
Yes, it's kind of surreal.
Yeah.
This is Oliver Chapin, and we looked at it. We talked about him last week, but he was also a really interesting modernist. Okay, so he does this course, extending all this patterning around it. That's so interesting. And that's a really, I mean, when I look at the collection, and I think that's some okay pieces from really good artists, and then we have some really good pieces. Now, I think that's a wonderful change. I think we're out of gift of Dave Baxter, 1992. And here's a Saul Wilson. When we were talking about scale, which is so important, and we look back at the Max Bone, which is about the biggest painting in this room, which was before abstract expressionism. But there's you get a sense of, scale is so important. Look at any of these paintings and imagine them bigger, and what kind of impression or statement it would make if it was bigger. I mean, the bird, or even Gamel's. I think there's a couple things in here. And someone was asking about, I mean, this is, we don't have a date for this, but this is a lithograph. Looks like a collage. Yeah. It's tiny.
it is. I thought it was going to be bigger. But you look at it and I think of it as like a fabulous poster. If it was larger, it would be like.
Yeah. But I think it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I think it's really wonderful.
It enjoys Wisconsin cheese with a beer.
Oh, there's the Dickinson.
Different what?
Oh, yes, yeah.
These are, if you go around, the museum is looking for a lot of artwork. And what you did was, for example, here, they definitely need some more Dickinson. So these are some of the people that they're looking for. I mean, they were even looking for some more finesse. But Blanche Lazelle we did for.
We should.
How are they?
Well, they don't need to get a.
No, what do you think the museum should own? That they're more
There's a line of
I think she did in the book, in the introduction.
I know.
Some of the art.